Hello, everyone. So my name is Kwong. I'm one of the co-founder and also CEO of Plato. Welcome to Plato Engineering Q&As, where we interview world-class engineering leaders, so CTOs, VPs of engineering, founders, to learn from the hard-won experiences building today's most successful product and engineering team. So welcome again. For those who don't know Plato, we are the mentorship platform for engineering leaders, powered by thousands of the best engineering leaders on the planet. You can learn from them with one-on-one mentorship, a small group mentorship, or bigger scale Q&As like this one. So hopefully you learn a ton. So I'm super excited today to welcome Michael Manapat. Michael is the head of engineering at Notion, a product that you all know that is used by more than 30 million users worldwide, growing from only 1 million 4 years ago, which is incredible. From 1 million to 30 million in only 4 years. Notion now has 500 employees, and Michael is the head of engineering, product, and design, leading a team of 230, including 180 engineers, which is, he learns a lot along the way. He's going to talk about engineering, EPD, collaboration, and efficiency. Michael, I had a blast preparing for this session with you. Everything we discussed was straight to the point, actionable, no bullshit, exactly what we all like. So before I transition to Michael, keep in mind that you can use the Q&A feature whenever you want. The presentation is going to be 10-15 minutes, and we are going to have a lot of time for questions. The questions need to come from you. We want to make sure that you ask the hard questions to Michael. Nothing is prepared. So we have Q&A, so make sure that to add your question along the way. Without further ado, let's welcome Michael on stage to tell us more about his time at Stripe, Google, Notion, working on EPD collaboration, and how to leverage it to achieve optimal efficiency. Michael.
Thank you, Kwong. Great to be here. Excited to talk a little bit about my experiences at Notion and at Stripe. I do have some slides I wanted us to go through just to set the context and sort of lead you through the history a bit more. So I have a bit of a less sweeping title. Wanted to talk about the approaches that Stripe and then Notion took to engineering, product, and design, and really more just about the random choices that were made along the way, what worked well, what didn't work well, and so forth. And I really want to save the meat of our discussion to the Q&A portion, which I'm excited about. So for this initial section, I want to give you a bit more intro and context, then talk about the Stripe and Notion EPD operating models with particular focus on the engineering management and product management relationship. And then I'll summarize with some quick takeaways before we jump into Q&A. So excited to go through all of this. Maybe to start, just to expound on Kwong's intro, just about me generally. So my career in tech started in 2011. I joined Google. I was a software engineer on ads backend. 2 years later, I joined Stripe. There were around 40 employees at the time and around 10 or 12 engineers. I joined as a software engineer there. It was a pretty interesting time. Stripe early on had very little structure. Everyone reported directly to Patrick, the CEO. There was no management, no one telling you what to do, besides ideas like go work on fraud or something like that, which I ended up doing. Most of my time there, I managed the group that built Stripe's machine learning products. So anything that was user-facing, powered by ML or AI. So there was a fraud product called Radar. We built a lending product called Capital, a data science product called Sigma. So things in that data products domain were my bread and butter. And I left the company after around 6 years. We reached around 2,000 employees. I joined Notion in early 2020, about 2 weeks before a lockdown for COVID began. So I had exactly enough time to meet people in person once before we began working from home. But at the time, there were around 35 people in total and 10 or 12 engineers. I joined to manage the engineering team. And as Kwong said, we're now at about 500 people in total, around 225 in engineering, product and design, and user research, which is what I manage now. So that's the quick intro. Now I'll dive into just some of these observations and learning. So first, at Stripe, like I mentioned, my group built a number of data or ML products, like this fraud product Radar. There are a number of really interesting things about Stripe's management history or its approach to engineering management and product management that have now sort of become lore, at least in circles that are familiar with Stripe. So one thing is that there were no engineering managers at Stripe until relatively late, early 2014, when there were more than 30 engineers and probably more than 100 people at the company. So Stripe had a reputation for not caring about engineering management. That actually, in my experience, was not true. EMs became the people who had the most power or were most empowered to drive things forward, ship product, and so forth. But we generally were, I would say, an undermanaged organization early on. Maybe even more interesting is that we didn't have any product managers in title until late in 2015. For a while, I was actually trying to pull it up for this talk, but there was a relatively infamous Quora question and answer answered by Patrick, Stripe's founder, about why we didn't have PMs. It was mainly because our engineers were so, quote, product-minded that we didn't feel like we needed them early. The subtleties here are that Stripe had a very strong BizOps team early on, sort of business operations, and they would often stand in and do product management-like work. So everything from talking to customers, getting customer feedback, to running and executing on complex product development processes and such. So BizOps was a stand-in for PMs until we began hiring PMs in title later in 2015. The second PM actually joined my team, and I worked with him on the first version of what would become Radar. But the interesting thing here is that there was no acute need or anything we were trying to solve for by hiring a product manager early or at this time. It was mostly just why don't we experiment and see what happens. And those experiments ended up going well because, as I'll talk about more later, there is quite a big difference between product managers and what they do and product engineers. The thing that I care most about from my history at Stripe is the way EMs and PMs work together. And I would describe the operating model there as both completely obvious to me as the thing that you want, but the longer I spend in industry, the more I realize that the model is actually perhaps relatively rare or not effectively common. So I would describe Stripe EM and PMs as being mind melded or being two copies of the same person. So EMs like me would do everything from work on product strategy with the PM to read PRDs very closely, to sit with design and examine every pixel or every UX flow. So from what we were shipping and why, EMs and PMs were kind of doing the same thing. On the flip side, PMs were also very involved in management of the team. So my PM partners had one-on-ones with all of the engineers every week or every 2 weeks. If I was out and there were issues with performance, for example, PMs would help there. So for 90% of the job, the EM and the PM were kind of copies of the same person. It is true that PM spent a bit more time doing go-to-market coordination than I would. And I would spend more time, say, reviewing tech specs than the PM would. But for the most part, the jobs are really overlapping, and I would describe the EM and the PM as joined at the hip or mind melded. And I really love that. My direct PM partner at Stripe had actually been a PM at Microsoft and then at Facebook before coming to Stripe. And he had what I thought was a very kind of nice way of describing this. So he said at Microsoft, PMs would go into the mountains twice a year and come down with stone tablets saying what to build. And those stone tablets would be handed to engineering, and engineers would just have to go do that thing. So very, very waterfall-y. At Facebook, if you built the wrong thing, so the what, then Mark would get mad at or fire the PM. And if the thing was built badly, then it was the EM who was on the hook. And at Stripe, it was the case that if anything went badly, whether it was product definition, the what or the why, or the implementation, like the how, it was both the EM and PM that were responsible. So they were really viewed as a unit. And I really love that. I found it to be very productive. So maybe we'll talk a bit about how we got to that point, but really it kind of happened organically and naturally. So that was Stripe really quickly. So I've been at Notion for the past 3 years. For those of you who don't know about Notion, we think of it as a connected workspace where it's one place for all of your docs, wikis, project management, other use cases with connections to other tools. But it's a hub for your work life. Many of you probably know we recently launched some AI capabilities to help you edit and generate docs using AI, which we're very excited about. On the Notion front, we had a similar, or in some ways similar, in other ways very different path than Stripe. So there were no product managers at Notion in title or in function until the middle of 2021, when we were also quite large, over 100 people. And unlike Stripe, where BizOps was actually doing PM-like work before the first PMs in title arrived, no one was doing any type of this, any work of PM type at Notion until a couple of years ago. Unlike Stripe, where the decision to hire PMs was an experiment, there was an acute need at Notion early on, which is that Notion had a fairly evolved and mature go-to-market organization, even when I joined, marketing, sales, customer success, and so forth. And people in those functions expected go-to-market and EPD coordination to happen via PMs. They were very unused to there just being an engineering org that was shipping things seemingly randomly with no way for go-to-market to say, prepare for those ships or to give input. So the initial motivation for hiring PMs was actually this PMs as glue in terms of coordinating how we build product generally. It turned out, and we would discover a little bit later, that there was an even more acute or serious need for PMs, which is that we weren't thinking very rigorously about our product roadmap or about segmentation. Notion sells to consumers and to teams and to enterprises, and all of them have different needs. We have different personas we're working with. So it's a relatively complex job to think through the product implications of all of these different audiences, and we weren't doing that well until PMs arrived. The second thing that's interesting about Notion is that engineering has grown much more quickly than product and design. And honestly, this happened for no good reason other than that engineering developed its recruiting processes a bit earlier, and the compounding growth built up over time. So even today, there are around 180 engineers and about 8 PMs and 8 designers, which is kind of shocking and really imbalanced. And frankly, this has not been optimal. So, I can make a joke about how where we ended up was really sort of striving for optimal inefficiency, because what ends up happening is that most or many engineering teams don't actually have product or design partners. So they're not moving as quickly as they can be because they're not able to sort of actively work with PMs or designers, and that does actually slow down our product development process a little bit. And then last thing worth noting about Notion is that unlike Stripe, where the EM and PM model was very clear, even implicitly so, at least to me, I haven't done a good job, or we haven't done a good job of articulating the model that we want at Notion. So if you go from team to team, I would say there are some teams that are like what I described at Stripe, where the EM and the PM are mind melding and have joint responsibility for everything. There are other teams where there's perhaps more of a traditional division, where the PM is driving product definition and approach, and the EM is focused on execution and management of the team and so forth. So we kind of ended up in a place where there isn't an overriding approach to the functions. Maybe to summarize some of the kind of acute differences here between the two companies. One, the products are actually quite different. Early Stripe was selling primarily to startups, whereas early Notion, luckily, a victim of our own success, was selling to consumers and startups and enterprises. I would say early Stripe was very focused on one persona. It was an API for developers, and developers were really in the mind of engineers and PMs in terms of how we built. Notion is building for a variety of personas. It has the individual consumer power user. It has enterprise admins who are making the buying decision for companies like Square and so forth. And early Stripe had a single, very clear value proposition. Use Stripe for payments and avoid all of the bureaucracy or difficulty you would have integrating payments with a legacy provider. Whereas Notion, there are a variety of things you could possibly do: docs, wikis, project management, and so forth. So these distinctions, in my mind, are all important in that Notion has a much more acute had and has a much more acute need for PMs early, because navigating all of these types of things is very difficult, even for an engineering team that is very product oriented. I would say second, for my first year or two at Stripe in the 50, 100, 150 employee range, the go-to-market organization there was relatively lightweight. Sales was happening via our BizOps team, and there wasn't really much marketing, for example. Whereas when I arrived at Notion and early on, there was a fairly developed sales and marketing and CS function, and they were pretty used to working with PMs for coordination. And I would say last notable difference is that the PM function was kind of de facto filled when needed at Stripe with BizOps people. It was non-existent at Notion until the first PMs were hired in name and title. So some quick takeaways from this, or just from these two experiences. So both Stripe and Notion had a lot of very, very, and still do, product-minded engineers early on. And that gets you a really long way. Product-minded engineers think very carefully about UX and design and product flows, how are attentive to detail, are very empathetic with the users and so forth. But as good as they are, they tend not to focus as much on questions like your segments and what does an enterprise user need versus a startup user versus a consumer, or personas. What does a student need versus an enterprise buyer? And while they're very product-minded engineers think a lot about how best to build a specific product, they're often not spending as much time thinking about the long-term strategy or roadmap. And I guess last, some engineers do, but many of them don't want to deal with, say, go-to-market coordination. So even if you have a strong product-minded engineering core, that does not fill the gap that PMs are needed to fill early on. Second thing I would say is that it's really helpful to have people in the in the product management function early on, even if they aren't PMs by name. So, and there are a couple of reasons here. One is that the minute you hire a product manager, I think the dynamics in the org change a bit. So when Notion hired our first PM, after years of having no one doing that work, that person kind of got the focus or the attention of the entire org. So go-to-market people are used to working with PMs. Now there's a PM in name. Everyone was kind of going to this person for all of their concerns, even though he was, in theory, the PM for a specific team or part of the org. So because of that change in expectation or dynamic, I think that person kind of got overloaded and wasn't set up for success early on. Stripe, on the other hand, had BizOps people doing the PM job for a while, so the transition was a bit more controlled and gradual. So I really recommend getting people, even if not PMs in title or in experience, but people doing that job early really helps in landing and smoothing things out. I think second or attached to this is you really have to have a unified hiring strategy for engineering, product, and design. I think those three functions at Notion hired relatively independently for a while, and then we ended up in this world where engineering is so much larger than product and design. And that means that engineering teams often don't have the right partners or are moving more slowly. Usually think of like building out those functions as a single one and designing the org carefully and growing them at the same rate. And Notion kind of has a hole to dig itself out of because of this asymmetry. And then the last thing I'll mention is that it's really important to know and articulate what you want from the EM and PM relationship early on. So is it the Stripe model? Is it the Facebook model? Is it something else? In some sense, it's as important for that model, whatever it is, to be known and so that you are hiring for it and coaching people towards it versus having a lot of variation from team to team. Because the challenge there, one of our challenges at Notion now is that, someone else in the org, whether say someone in marketing or say someone in design, they don't know what to expect when interacting with any given EM or PM. Are these people doing the same thing? Do they have a strict division in their roles? Even the EMs and PMs themselves might not know what we expect of them. So I definitely encourage you to figure out what makes sense for your company and to be clear about what you want from that relationship when you're hiring and when you're sort of talking to your team about expectations. And probably unsurprisingly, I'm a big fan of the Stripe model where the EMs and the PMs are pretty much the same person in a lot of ways. So I want to actually stop there and this quick overview of kind of the challenges I've gone through or experienced or seen in these two companies and some quick takeaways. And I want to switch it off and just have a discussion via Q&A.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. It's so interesting to see two different stories with two different root cause impacts. There's a lot of questions. So we have 22 minutes, so let's jump in. First question is, how do you measure the extent of EPD collaboration and what metrics do you use to evaluate success? It's a hard one.
Yeah, it's a great question, Huang, and I'm not going to have a specific answer for you right now. We aren't looking at efficiency of EPD with any kind of internal metrics as a whole. Obviously, there are engineering metrics we can look at. Things like, number of deploys per day. That's actually not something that is true because we only deploy once per day, or number of rollbacks. There are engineering efficiency things. But on the org overall and how we're doing, for right now, it's roughly sort of my just staring at it and getting a sense of, is this team shipping consistently? Do they have a roadmap? Are they hitting their ship dates? Things like that. What's the quality of the work and so forth? So I don't have a good metric for are all of the functions in EPD working well together. I'm curious if anyone else does or has a good sense of how to measure the efficiency of collaboration.
It's a hard one. If someone has any clue, let us know in the chat. Sorry.
Yeah, I will say one of my goals is in having a strong engineering and product partnership at every level of the org. What it actually means is that I want every team to have a specific charter metric. So, for example, the AI team might be driving usage, number of AI of invocations of Notion AI per day as a measure of utility. And that metric should be owned by the EM and the PM jointly. Or we have a team working on project management, and number of daily active users of project management should be owned by the EM and PM jointly. So in some sense, if all of the business and product metrics are owned by the EPD leaders together, and all of those metrics are moving in the right direction and the right rate, that in some sense is a proxy measure for these partnerships are going well.
You mentioned the AI tool. There's a question about that from Jeffrey. So Notion launched an AI helper tool. Take me through how that product decision happened from zero to launch. We were talking about that earlier today. It's kind of fun.
It's a great question. So I think for a lot of what Notion does, there's a combination of road mapping and idea generation from teams themselves. And there's also some amount of ideation and thinking from the founders and the leadership team. So what actually happened with AI is like one of our founders had been just dabbling with AI for a while, for the past year. I developed an interest there. And then as all of you know, this summer, last summer and early fall, just the progress in generative AI seemed to be just kind of mind-bogglingly fast. So in October, we kind of sat down and we're like, what are the ways, we being the founders and I sat down, we're like, what are the things that we could be doing here that would really enhance the Notion product? And we came up with some examples of the writer tools, which have now been launched, using Notion AI, using AI for project management, stuff of that sort. So we essentially made the decision with the founders that this is something we should invest in, and we created a tiger team. One of our founders and we pulled 3 engineers from across the org to go sit down, heads down, and build V1 of this thing. And they raced to do that. They got the first alpha out in, 4 or 5 or 6 weeks. And then we had the full general release of the Notion AI writing tools a couple of weeks ago. Now we actually have formalized the effort where there was an AI team that's staffed that is now working on multiple different AI products. We also have, the core existing Notion engineering teams working on AI things themselves. So we've now shifted into a mode where a lot of the organization is doing it. But those early days were idea from the founders, followed by a quick tiger team to execute on that before we kind of normalize the execution model.
Yeah. It definitely helps to have one of the founder involved, and having a small team help you move super fast. 4 to 6 weeks is super fast given the code base that you probably have at Notion, which is super interesting. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. We have a question that's been the most voted from Ram Singh. Do you have a preferences for structuring teams, cross-functional versus matrix dotted line, and why?
So it's a great question, and it's there's a question about management chains and a question about operations. So the model that's true here and at Stripe is that the management chains are all functional. So, design reports up through our design manager, and product managers report through product managers, engineering through engineering managers. There isn't a model where the manager of a team manages all of the functions. So reporting is very functionally oriented. And I think that's important from helping people develop or learn the right skills, right? Like a designer should have a design manager to help them grow in their expertise as a designer. And being a product manager is quite different than being an engineer in terms of the skills and career progression. So we want to keep the management chains functional in nature so that people are growing and developing and being coached in the right ways. But in terms of operation of the teams, what I want is for each team to think of itself as we are the search team at Notion, and you have PMs and engineers and designers working on search, and the business or product area is your primary team. So, I'd want an engineer to say, I'm on the search team, a designer to say, I'm on the search team, and not to say, I'm on design versus product and so forth, because then you're all kind of in it together with this like collective desire to move the product or the business, and you identify more with, your product area than with your like functional team. I think that has at Stripe at least, and hopefully here too, resulted in the best outcomes.
For question, Ram, there's a lot of question, so I'm going to jump straight to the next one. We have Melanie Zenz. You mentioned the imbalance of engineering and product design teams. What is a good ratio for building a collaborative cross-functional team for the ultimate outcome of mind meld? So I think we discussed this earlier today. Michael, you mentioned 180 engineers and 8 PM, which is pretty imbalanced. But what do you think is the right balance?
So I would start with like ideally for an engineering, I would think to start actually on ratios between engineering managers and product managers. If you have a team that is shipping and building user-facing product, I would want there to be an EM and a PM that are both responsible for that team and generally for nothing else. And at each node of the organizational tree or hierarchy, there should be an EM and a PM who are focused precisely on their part of the tree. So in some sense, the ratios I care about are more about, there's an engineering manager, a product manager, and a designer, each attached to a product area. There's generally guidance in the industry around you wanting to have an engineering manager and a product manager for roughly every 8 engineers or so. And I think that number is like approximately correct. So we're like 2 to 3x off at Notion. But in some sense, what I'm doing org planning now, it's much more around the pairing of designer and PM and EMs, or having that trio at each of the nodes in the org chart. I'm generally staring less at the ratio of number of engineers to PMs. I think really quickly, the thing that's happening now, which is not ideal, is that PMs are being stretched across multiple teams. So there might be 3 teams, each of which has an EM, and then one product manager who is working with each of those teams. And that PM then has to page in and page out state across multiple product areas. And there's no way you get to that mind meld stage if one person in the partnership has more responsibility or more scope than the other person does. So in my mind, it's really around the EM and PM, the pairing, and making sure those are that ratio stays 1-to-1.
All right. So if my math are correct, you're hiring 15 PMs right now. So if anyone is interested, Michael's here. All right. The next question is actually, let's talk about efficiency versus speed and quality from Carl. Carl 1, how do you view the relationship between efficiency, speed, and quality? How do you balance the two?
It's a great question, and it's one that we have been sort of struggling with a bit here from a what to emphasize and when. I would say early on in Notion's history, there was very much a focus on quality above all else. And then as the company grew and there was more and more to build, we began shifting a bit more towards sort of speed and getting things out. And we're actually, I think, switching back a bit now. We're trying to return to our previous emphasis on quality, even if that means our shipping timelines are sort of a bit more extended. I have what might be a bad answer here, which is that in the end, what you emphasize, shipping fast or shipping things that are very polished, is ultimately like a value that the organization has. Like, I don't know of any kind of mass A/B tests or counterfactual evaluations where you can say companies that focus on quality or companies that focus on speed, one does better than the other class. I would love to see that if any of you know of anything like that. But I think Notion from a cultural DNA standpoint is one that is cares about quality and can be good about quality. So we're trying to emphasize that more now, and we kind of drifted from that unintentionally over the past couple of years.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Every company is probably switching at some point from speed to quality. So we talked a lot about engineering managers, EM and PM. What about a tech lead? Question from Piranavan. How do you fit in tech leads in the EM and PM relationship?
So an interesting thing about, I guess, all of my roles, Google and then Stripe and then Notion, is that there's no formal tech lead notion, no pun intended, sort of any of these companies, in the sense of like tech lead is not a title or a role that people have. There are people who are like de facto tech leads in that they might be the most experienced engineer on the team, or it might be the engineer who enjoys and is really good at giving feedback and driving direction in a roadmap and so forth. But first thing is that it's not a formalized role in any sense here, and it was not at Stripe, at least at the time that I was there. When there are emergent tech leads, they become and they work very closely with the EM and PM and design group. So I think planning out a team's roadmap, its product strategy, all of that really depends on a deep understanding of what is technically possible. And in general, I expect either the EM to have that knowledge or for that person to loop in the appropriate engineer or tech lead. So this is a long way of saying that when I talk about the EM and PM relationship, someone in that group driving forward a team has to have a deep understanding of the technology. And if it's not the EM, then someone who's de facto doing the tech lead job needs to be in the room for all these discussions if you want things to execute well.
Got it. Recruiting question from Ivan. Should we include product managers' questions as part of the engineering hiring pipeline and hire more product-minded engineers? Although one of your key takeaway was product-minded engineers are not PM, but it's still important to have product-minded engineers. So what do you think about that?
Yes, that's one of my takeaways, but this is a great question. And I would say definitively sort of the answer to this is yes. So as an example, when we began hiring engineering managers from the outside at Notion, we introduced an interview question that was essentially, here is a product requirements doc, or here is a plan for a new product area. Actually critique it. So we could actually see, does this engineering manager have, are they thoughtful about product? Can they reason about what's not working well with this, what is working well, solutions, and so forth. So any EM in Notion who is going to work on a product-focused team has an interview question that is really focused on like product rigor and thoughtfulness. And then every engineer has also been asked a question that is a combination of systems design and product thinking. So if you were to build a product that roughly did this, like what would it look like and how would it work and how would you do these things, both from a product standpoint and a technical one. So I'm very much a fan and would definitely encourage you to have questions like this in your interview loops, because it does mean that when you are in a situation like we are now, where teams don't always have dedicated product partners, engineers can unblock themselves and make progress if they're good at this type of thinking. So it's very important to include these types of evaluations in your interview process.
Yeah. If you're interested to know more about this, we actually talked about this last year at another interview, how to hire great product engineers. We discussed that. So, all right. Let's talk about design a little bit. So what about design? Notion and Stripe have two greatly designed products. You have great designer early on, and I think there was another question about the cadence and how far are you planning for the EPD tray works on quarterly or another cadence, and how far ahead does the design needs to be ahead of engineering, for instance?
So both Notion and Stripe have really great design teams, and in some sense, at both companies, design was they were responsible for making sure the system as a whole was holistic and thoughtful and so forth. So the model at both companies has been, designers have areas of responsibility. Like a particular designer might be working on AI, for instance, or our project management and docs tools and so forth. But they'll always bring their work back to the centralized design team, which is reviewing everything together via design crit, design collab, stuff like that. And in some sense, they are the guardians and make sure that the distinct parts of the product owned by different teams aren't diverging too much and are working together well. That's part one. I think part two is, just like with product management, frankly, our design team has not grown as fast as it needs to. It's roughly as large as our PM team. So you can imagine, 180 engineers, 8 PMs, 8 designers. Our product management and design teams are doing a lot of work, so I have some catching up to do there. But they are. I keep on talking about EM and PM pairs. It's really unfair in that, design should, is as key a part of that trio or triad when things are properly staffed. That's about design really quickly. On cadence, we tend to do planning twice a year. So we have a very intensive annual planning process in December and January, and a lighter weight one in the summer for H2, and a very, very, very lightweight sort of check-in in between quarters. But I would say, what we are trying to do for 2023, strategic goals, overall resourcing, that was set in December and January. And we might tweak a bit at the end of Q1 and tweak a bit more at the end of H1. But it's roughly biannual planning, twice a year.
Got it. We have 2 minutes left. So lightning speed questions, 3 super fast questions. It's a ritual. I like to ask those questions to our speakers. First question is, who's been a mentor of yours?
Oh, there have been a lot over the years. I can just name all of my managers. I've actually historically not tended to have many mentors outside of my managers, but everyone from Ivan, Notion's CEO, on thinking about product and design, to David Singleton, who is Stripe's CTO and was my manager for a while there, on thinking about sort of growth in the org. They've all I've just benefited so much from having been coached by all of my previous managers.
David's great. We probably have him in the show someday. It's been one of the most voted questions too. Is what's been one book has been the most impactful in your career?
It's probably a silly one. I shouldn't say silly, but I'm actually a big fan of books around management that are written by people who were previously in the military. So the one that really comes to mind, which I buy for a lot of people I work with directly, is this book, Extreme Ownership, by Jocko Willink. There's also a follow-up book, The Dichotomy of Leadership. So I would recommend both of those books, not just for managers, but for anyone on your team, really. And I would say I really like them because something I love about Notion and about Stripe is the sense of end-to-end ownership. nothing is not your responsibility, nothing is below your job, and these books do a good job of like formalizing that mentality.
I love this book too. Thank you for. So we have a few seconds left. So let's wrap up for today, Michael. Thanks again for your time, being one of our fantastic mentors. It's been great. So a lot of key takeaways, like product mandate engineers are not PMs, have people in PMs early on, articulate really well EM-PM relationship. Small teams, especially if you have a founder, can ship super fast. 1 EM for 1 PM, many other learnings, but that was great. Everyone, thanks for being here.